Welcome, the anointed ones. The truth doesn't knock. It breaks the door and exposes who was hiding behind it. There's a moment in every chosen one's journey when the universe stops playing subtle, stops whispering hints, and just throws the whole truth on the table like, welp, they're going to find out anyway. And when that moment arrives, oh, people don't simply react, they unravel. The truth concerning you wasn't just uncovered, it spilled, it circulated, and it hit the very people who tried to bury it like a spiritual boomerang with perfect aim. Here's a fact that psychologists have known for years. Nothing destabilizes a person faster than realizing the narrative they built about someone was completely wrong. It triggers panic, denial, embarrassment, rage. Basically emotional gymnastics that not even Olympics judges can score fairly. That's exactly what's happening around you. They spent months, years, maybe even whole seasons of their life, confidently believing they figured you out. They thought they had your identity in a chokehold, like they were the unofficial narrators of your destiny. They treated their assumptions as factual, their opinions as cosmic truth, and their judgments as your biography. But the universe did what it always does with chosen ones. It waited for the perfect moment and then flipped the entire script so violently that everybody who was watching is now experiencing spiritual vertigo. People aren't just whispering, they're recalibrating. They're not just shocked, they're questioning their eyesight. Some are pretending they always knew. Meanwhile, their brain is buffering like a bad internet connection. Because the truth that came out about you didn't just challenge their beliefs. It humbled their ego, exposed their motives, and forced them to confront the version of you they hoped was real instead of the version that actually is. And here's the funny part. The very people who claimed you weren't that special are now holding emergency meetings in their minds, trying to figure out how someone they dismissed turned out to be the one person nobody can replace, ignore, or outshine. It's giving plot twist fatigue, and they're not handling it well. So as the truth spreads, effortlessly, organically, undeniably, one thing becomes clear: you didn't change. Their illusion of you collapsed, and now they're losing their sanity trying to figure out how they missed what was in front of them the whole time. Number one, they finally realized you weren't trying to impress them. You were busy outgrowing their entire ecosystem. For the longest time, people around you were convinced you cared about their approval. They thought you were playing the same game they were playing, trying to fit in, trying to be liked, trying to be accepted, trying to measure up to their social expectations. They assumed every quiet moment meant you were waiting for validation, that every setback would send you running to them, and that every success you had was luck rather than intention. They built a whole storyline around you, and it worked only because they didn't expect you to grow beyond it. But the truth hit them recently, and it hit them hard. You were never in the competition. While they spent their time comparing, gossiping, analyzing, and ranking each other, you were doing something totally different. You were evolving, you were healing, learning, building, observing, and adjusting your inner world. You weren't in their race because you were on a different path entirely. They were busy trying to win social points while you were busy becoming someone their entire environment could no longer contain. Your growth exposed something uncomfortable. Their world is too small for the version of you that has now emerged. And they realized this, not through your words, but through your results. You didn't beg for attention. You didn't fight for a seat at the table. You outgrew the room so completely that even the table itself became irrelevant. That's the moment they understood you were no longer part of the dynamic they were trying to control. They also discovered that the limitations they placed on you were projections, not reality. What they thought was insecurity was actually quiet self-development. What they thought was confusion was actually strategic withdrawal. What they thought was weakness was actually the strength needed to break cycles they themselves are still stuck in. They underestimated not only your potential, but also your discipline, your clarity, and your depth. Now they're experiencing a kind of shock they can't hide. It's unsettling to realize the person they dismissed is the one who silently surpassed them. And the worst part for them? You weren't even trying to outdo anyone. You were simply removing anything that didn't align with your purpose. And without effort, you stepped into a level they didn't believe you were capable of. That's why they're losing stability now. Because the truth is undeniable. They didn't lose the old you. They just failed to keep up with the upgraded version. Number 2, they discovered you were operating with information they never had access to. What unsettled people the most wasn't just your growth. It was the realization that you were moving with a level of understanding they couldn't explain. For a long time, they assumed you were clueless. They thought they could hide things from you, manipulate situations, or stay 2 steps ahead. But the truth that recently surfaced is this: you weren't behind. You were simply quiet. You weren't confused. You were observant. And while they were busy underestimating you, you were processing details they didn't even notice. People expected you to operate from surface-level perception, because that's how they operate. They judge what they can see, what they hear, and what they assume. But you've always had a mind that catches hidden meanings, patterns, intentions, shifts in tone, changes in behavior, and energy that contradicts words. You were reading the room when they thought you were distracted. You were catching motives while they thought you were slow. You were uncovering truths while they thought you were in the dark. When this came to light, it shook them. They realized you were responding to things they didn't know you understood. You weren't reacting blindly. You were acting from insight. Decisions they thought were random turned out to be intentional. Distances you created weren't emotional. They were strategic. The timing of your moves wasn't coincidental. It was based on a clarity they didn't know you had. This truth humbled people in ways they're trying hard not to show. They now understand that they weren't dealing with someone they could mislead with half stories or charm with false friendliness. They were dealing with someone who sees beneath the surface, someone who understands people even when they're trying not to be understood, someone who can piece together truth without needing anyone to confess it. And now they're uneasy, not because you exposed them publicly, but because you saw through them privately. The revelation that you've always had access to an inner intelligence they can't imitate or replicate has shifted the entire power dynamic. They can no longer treat you like someone who doesn't know what's going on, because the truth is, you knew the whole time. Number 3, they uncovered that you weren't the weak one. You were the one enduring what would have broken them instantly. For a long time, people misread your strength because it didn't look loud. It didn't come with dramatic reactions, constant explanations, or public displays of toughness. You handled difficulties in ways that didn't make sense to them, so they assumed you were struggling or barely holding it together. They didn't realize that your calmness wasn't denial. It was resilience working in silence. The truth that recently surfaced is that the situations you walked through weren't small, and they definitely weren't easy. You dealt with burdens that required emotional stamina, mental discipline, and spiritual grounding most people don't possess. You carried responsibilities, betrayals, heartbreaks, disappointments, and pressures that would have crushed the same people who were calling you weak. They had no idea you were surviving storms they couldn't even stand in for a second. People often think strength looks like aggression or dominance, but your strength looked like patience, like showing up even when you were exhausted, like staying grounded when everything around you felt unstable, like refusing to become bitter even when you had every reason to. They only saw the surface, so they thought you were soft. They didn't know you were holding up your own world with muscles they never had to grow. Now the truth is out, and it's hitting them harder than they expected. They're realizing that the person they dismissed as fragile was actually the one carrying internal battles with unmatched endurance. They're learning that your quiet suffering wasn't weakness. It was evidence of a type of strength they can't perform or fake. And now it makes sense to them, how you overcame things without losing your character, how you kept going without collapsing, how you stayed compassionate while being tested repeatedly. This revelation embarrasses them because it exposes their misjudgment. They would have folded under the pressure they watched you survive. They would have given up on paths you kept walking, and they would have broken in situations you mastered with grace. The truth is clear now. You were never the weak one. You were simply the one strong enough to endure battles they never knew you fought, and stronger than they ever imagined you to be. Number 4, they realized you never fought back, because you outranked them spiritually. People were convinced your silence meant they were winning. They assumed your lack of retaliation meant they had overpowered you, intimidated you, or cornered you. They bragged about how you didn't say anything, how you didn't respond, how you let it slide, and they believed that was proof you were afraid. But the truth that broke through recently is painfully simple. You weren't scared. You were operating from a higher place. Your restraint wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It was wisdom. It was the clear understanding that responding to certain behavior only dignifies it. You weren't confused or lost. You were fully aware of what was happening and consciously chose not to engage. You recognized early on that their energy was beneath your spiritual standards. Their intentions were too small, and their motives were too corrupted to deserve any part of your attention. They didn't realize you outranked them, not in arrogance, but in consciousness. You saw the long-term consequences of actions they treated like harmless games. You understood the spiritual cost of matching their negativity. You were aware that stepping into their chaos would pull you out of alignment with the purpose you were growing into. So you walked away, not because you couldn't fight, but because fighting would have lowered your frequency. And now that the truth is out, it's crushing their ego. They finally see that you weren't ignoring them because they intimidated you. You were ignoring them because engaging with them would have been a downgrade. They're realizing your silence wasn't a lack of power. It was the presence of power they didn't recognize. It was the type of authority that doesn't need to scream, clap back, or prove anything. What unsettles them the most is that they have no strategy for someone who refuses to step into the battlefield they created. Their whole plan relied on dragging you into conflict so they could feel relevant. But you held your ground without lifting a finger. You outclassed the attack by refusing to validate it. Now they're left battling an opponent who never showed up, and discovering that you were never beneath them. You were above the entire situation the whole time. Number 5, your absence revealed that you were the one, anchoring the entire social atmosphere. People never notice the real foundation of a space until it's gone. For the longest time, you were treated like you didn't matter, like you were just there, like your presence didn't carry weight. They assumed the group functioned smoothly because everyone played their part, not realizing that you were the one holding the entire structure together. But the moment you stepped back, the truth exposed itself in a way nobody could deny. The harmony people took for granted suddenly cracked. Conversations that used to flow easily felt awkward. Personalities that once seemed friendly started clashing. Small misunderstandings turned into unnecessary drama. Without you, the atmosphere lost its balance, because the person who naturally brought peace, direction, and emotional intelligence to the room was no longer in it. They didn't realize how much you contributed, because you weren't loud about it. You weren't trying to steal the spotlight or dominate the space. Your presence simply regulated things. You understood when to lighten the mood, when to redirect tension, when to mediate without making it obvious. You sensed when someone was off and adjusted yourself in a way that helped the energy settle. All of that looked effortless, so people assumed it wasn't important. But when you left, everything they blamed you for, tension, drama, misunderstandings, suddenly multiplied without you being there. The very issues they projected onto you were actually being suppressed by you. You weren't the problem, you were the shield. You weren't stirring trouble, you were preventing it. Your absence didn't just create a gap, it exposed the truth about everyone else. Now they're trying to figure out why things feel off, why the group isn't clicking, why there's no emotional glue holding everything together, and slowly it's sinking in. The person they overlooked was the one quietly keeping everyone aligned. You were the grounding force no one acknowledged, until the atmosphere fell apart without you. Your absence became the evidence they could never deny. The room didn't collapse because you left. It collapsed because you were the one holding it up the whole time. Number 6, they found out that the respect people show you behind closed doors is far greater than what they admit publicly. What shocked your critics wasn't your growth or your strength. It was what people were saying about you when they thought no one was listening. For a long time, your haters felt confident. They believed everyone saw you the way they painted you. Unimportant, unimpressive, irrelevant. They assumed their opinions were the public consensus. But the truth slipped out in the most uncomfortable way for them. People actually respect you far more privately than they ever show publicly. It turns out you have supporters who never raised their hands, but always had your back. People who admired your character, your resilience, your integrity, and your way of moving through life without stepping on others to get ahead. Some folks have been defending your name in rooms you've never stepped into. Some have been correcting lies, interrupting gossip, shutting down disrespect, and giving you credit, even when it wasn't fashionable to do so. This revelation rattled your haters because it destroyed their confidence. They built an entire identity around convincing others that you didn't matter. They portrayed you as someone easy to dismiss, someone nobody valued, someone who was just there. But when the truth came out, that people actually hold you in high regard, their whole narrative collapsed. The person they tried to minimize was being quietly uplifted by the same audience they were trying to influence. What's even funnier is that some of the very people who stayed silent in public were the ones speaking the loudest in private in your defense. Respect doesn't always show up in applause or public praise. Sometimes it shows up in how people correct lies when you're not around. And you earned that kind of respect without even trying. Your consistency, your character, and your way of handling adversity built credibility that can't be faked. That realization hit your critics like cold water. They now understand that they misjudged the room. They thought they had everyone agreeing with them, but what they actually had was people watching them expose their own insecurity while quietly respecting you more. Your haters aren't just angry, they're embarrassed. because the truth is undeniable now. You were never insignificant. People were just too intimidated to admit how highly they think of you. Number 7, they uncovered that you weren't the problem, you were the mirror. For the longest time, people were convinced that you were the source of their discomfort. They blamed you for tension, for misunderstandings, for emotional shifts they didn't know how to explain. They told themselves you were too much, too different, or too complicated, because it was easier to name you as the issue than to face what your presence was revealing about them. But the moment truth cracked open, everything became clear. You weren't the disturbance, you were the reflection. Your life didn't expose their lies. It exposed the parts of themselves they had been avoiding for years. When they saw your growth, it didn't threaten their position. It threatened the excuses they were hiding behind. Your confidence highlighted their insecurity. Your honesty highlighted their avoidance. Your progress made their stagnation impossible to ignore. Without saying a word, you showed them who they could be, and that made them uncomfortable. People don't get angry at the mirror because it's wrong. They get angry because it's accurate. And that's exactly what happened with you. Every time you leveled up, they were reminded of the areas in their own life where they weren't doing the work. Every time you healed, they were reminded of wounds they refused to face. Every time you walked in your truth, they were reminded of how long they had been running from theirs. The moment they finally realized this, panic set in, because now the narrative they built, the one where you were the issue, no longer made sense. They saw that removing you didn't improve their life, didn't fix their patterns, didn't make them happier, stronger, or wiser. All the chaos they blamed on you stayed exactly where it was, proving it had never been coming from you. It was rooted in them. This truth hit harder than anything you could have ever said. It stripped away the illusion they depended on and left them face to face with themselves. And that's the part they can't handle, recognizing that the conflict wasn't external, it was internal. You didn't create their problems. You simply made it impossible for them to hide from what was already broken. You weren't the villain. You were the mirror they weren't ready to look into. Number 8. They realized you gained influence without playing their social games. Nothing irritated your critics more than watching you rise without participating in the games they rely on for relevance. They used strategies that required endless effort, aligning with certain people, forming cliques, bending their personality to fit into whatever group seemed most beneficial. They worked overtime trying to control narratives, maintain appearances, and gather social leverage. And even with all that, their influence barely stretched beyond the people they repeatedly tried to impress. Meanwhile, you moved through life with a completely different approach. You weren't chasing attention or alliances. You weren't adjusting your personality to win approval. You weren't rehearsing your behavior or monitoring every word to appear strategic. You simply showed up as yourself, consistent, grounded, straightforward. And somehow, that alone began to attract the kind of influence their entire playbook couldn't create. What bothered them most was how natural your impact was. You didn't force it. You didn't sell yourself. You didn't manipulate situations to gain advantage. Your influence came from presence, not performance. The way you carried yourself, the way you handled situations, the way you spoke, and even the way you treated people built a reputation stronger than anything they tried to manufacture. People trusted you without being persuaded. They respected you without being pressured. They chose you without being influenced by a campaign. This truth completely unraveled the people who believed power only comes from politics. They assumed you would remain invisible because you didn't join their alliances or follow their social rituals. But your authenticity outpaced their effort. Your integrity overshadowed their tactics. And the natural way people gravitated toward you exposed the weakness in their entire strategy. They spent so much energy climbing ladders, only to discover you walked right past them without stepping on a single rung. They invested in connections, gossip, and image building, while you invested in self-growth, purpose, and staying aligned with who you truly are. And that's exactly why you ended up where they thought only their methods could take them. Your rise challenged everything they believed about influence. It proved that real power doesn't come from playing the game. It comes from being someone who doesn't need to. You didn't just outperform their strategy, you made it look pointless, and that's the part they still can't swallow. Number 9, they discovered you're not easily replaced. You're unrepeatable. At first, people assumed that losing you would barely register. They believed you were interchangeable, like anyone else could fill the space you left behind. They convinced themselves your absence would be a small inconvenience, a momentary adjustment, nothing more. But once you stepped back, the reality slapped them with a force they weren't prepared for. What you brought to the table wasn't common, wasn't typical, and wasn't available on demand. You weren't a placeholder. You were the difference. They expected life to continue smoothly without your presence, but everything felt off the moment you were gone. Conversations lacked depth. Interactions felt forced. Plans didn't flow the same way. The energy shifted in a way they couldn't ignore. It wasn't because you were doing the most. It's because the quality you naturally carried isn't something people can mimic. You have a way of grounding situations, adding clarity, elevating the mood, offering perspective, and creating alignment without even trying. These are traits people don't appreciate until the room feels empty without them. The truth that weighs on them now is simple but heavy. You're not repeatable. The combination of your character, emotional strength, intuition, humor, compassion, mental sharpness, and the unique frequency you carry doesn't come in duplicates. People can imitate your style, but they can't replicate your presence. They can copy your words, but they can't recreate your spirit. They can try to replace you with someone similar, but similarity isn't substance, and they can feel the difference instantly. What's haunting them now isn't just regret, it's realization. They thought you'd be easy to replace because they were blind to the value you carried. They took your consistency for granted. They underestimated your impact because it felt so effortless. They treated your loyalty like a default setting. But once you removed yourself, they finally understood that the qualities you offered weren't common. They were rare, intentional, and deeply rooted. And now they're stuck with the aftermath. The space you filled hasn't been filled again. It's not because they didn't try, it's because they can't. They lost something irreplaceable while thinking it was ordinary. You weren't another face in the room. You were the one thing the room can't function without. And they learned that truth the hard way. Number 10. They finally saw that your silence wasn't emptiness. It was discernment, operating at high voltage. Your quiet was never a void. It was a scanning field. While they interpreted your stillness as weakness, you were downloading data, reading patterns, evaluating motives, mapping out the internal landscape of every person in the room. You weren't responding because you were decoding. What they thought was passivity was actually precision. What they misread as confusion was you allowing their true character to expose itself without interference. You don't interrupt people who are revealing themselves. You watch, you learn, you store the information for the moment it becomes relevant. When they finally realized you weren't silent because you didn't know what to say, but because you understood far too much, the psychological tables flipped instantly. They recognized that your stillness wasn't emptiness. It was voltage, high-frequency intuition running so intensely that speaking prematurely would have been a downgrade. That's why they panicked. If you could perceive all that without speaking, what else did you see that they thought they hid? Your silence was your surveillance. Your calm was your compass. Your restraint forced their truth out into the open. And now they understand the terrifying reality. You weren't behind, you were ahead. You weren't unaware, or you were hyper-aware. You weren't intimidated, you were enlightened, collecting the final pieces that would confirm what your spirit already knew. Their confidence didn't crumble because you spoke. It crumbled because you finally revealed you were never in the dark. They were. Number 11. They realized their lies didn't destroy you. They destroyed their credibility. What they thought would break you became the very thing that broke the illusion of who they pretended to be. They didn't just miscalculate. They sabotaged themselves publicly, slowly, and irreversibly. Every lie they told had an expiration date, and when the truth finally surfaced, it exposed just how much energy they invested in trying to erase you. People started noticing the pattern. Why is this person always talking about you? Why do they sound so rehearsed? Why is the story always shifting? Your haters didn't realize something critical. The more a lie is repeated, the heavier it becomes for the one carrying it. Their own narrative collapsed under its weight. Their reputation didn't erode in one moment. It dissolved drip by drip as their inconsistencies grew too loud to ignore. Meanwhile, you kept evolving. You kept rising. You kept producing results that contradicted every rumor whispered in the dark. Your life became evidence. Your presence became proof. And when evidence enters the room, narratives vanish. Eventually, people stopped asking, "Is what they said about you true?" They started asking, "Why are they so obsessed?" That shift is what destroyed your haters. Because now the scrutiny is on them, their motives, their insecurities, their envy, their fixation. They became the villain in their own story, not because you exposed them, but because the truth exposed itself through their desperation. Your integrity survived. Their credibility didn't. And the most devastating part, they must now live inside the very narrative they built for you, while you walk freely in the truth they tried to bury. Number 12. They discovered you weren't alone. You were divinely backed the entire time. The moment this truth surfaced, it shook them on a level they were not prepared for. For years, they assumed your survival was luck, your progress was chance, and your resilience was coincidence. They convinced themselves you were just getting by, but eventually, someone connected the dots and said the one thing your haters never wanted to hear. Every attack on them keeps failing. Something is protecting this person. That single realization rewired the entire narrative. Suddenly, your breakthroughs weren't seen as random wins. They were seen as signs. Your rise wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. The more they tried to undermine you, the more obvious it became that there was a barrier around you they couldn't penetrate. Plans fell apart. Plots leaked. People switched sides at the last second. Opportunities opened where there should have been none. Every sabotage mysteriously malfunctioned. Your haters can lie, pretend, and posture, but one thing they can't ignore is patterns. And the pattern around your life was undeniable. Every weapon aimed at you misfired. Every trap set for you caught the wrong person. Every betrayal cleared your path instead of blocking it. That's when fear replaced arrogance, because now they weren't dealing with just you. They were dealing with something, or someone, that outranked them spiritually, energetically, and morally. Every failure of their schemes became a reminder that they were up against protection, stronger than their intentions. Your existence started to feel like a divine contradiction to their agenda. And here's the part that rattled them the most. Your calm made sense. Your patience made sense. Your silence made sense. You weren't afraid. You were aligned. You were moving with a backing they couldn't interfere with or manipulate. When they realized you weren't walking alone, the game changed. Not in your favor, it was already in your favor, but in their awareness. And now they know the truth. They never had a real chance. Not against you, not against what stands with you. Number 13. They found out you didn't need closure because you already had the truth. This revelation rattled them more than any confrontation ever could. They expected you to circle back, to dig for explanations, to chase some emotional cleanup that would make them feel relevant. They thought you'd come knocking, desperate for answers or validation, but you never returned. You walked away with a certainty that made them realize you weren't waiting on anything from them. Not their honesty, not their confession, not their apology. You already understood everything you needed to know. What they didn't grasp is that your clarity didn't come from their words. It came from your discernment. You connected details they thought were hidden. You recognized patterns they assumed were invisible. You studied their actions long before they realized you were paying attention. By the time they revealed their truth, you had already outgrown the entire storyline. That's why you didn't argue. That's why you didn't send paragraphs or demand explanations. Closure wasn't missing. It was completed the moment you accepted who they truly were. And that's what troubles them now. Your silence wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't emotional shutdown. It was the confidence of someone who had already processed the situation and made peace with reality. You weren't clinging to what happened. You were walking toward what's next. Meanwhile, they were left in the same space, holding on to a version of events you had already released. They expected you to need them to finish the story, but you wrote your own ending without their participation. That's the part that eats at them. You didn't require their truth because you already had your own. You didn't need their closure because you had already closed the chapter internally. You moved forward while they remained stuck in the moment they hurt you. Now they're the ones replaying scenes, revisiting conversations, and wishing they had handled you differently. They weren't prepared for the power of someone who doesn't return for clarity. They weren't ready for someone who doesn't need permission to heal. And the truth they're forced to accept now is simple. You didn't walk away lost. You walked away done. Number 14, they realized their worst fear. People now see you for who you actually are, not who they painted you to be. This is the moment they were never prepared for. The moment the false version of you they built finally crumbled under the weight of reality. For the longest time, they depended on whispers, distortions, and exaggerated stories to control how others viewed you. They assumed their version of you would stick permanently. They thought their influence was strong enough to shape public perception forever. But truth has a habit of resurfacing in ways no one can stop. And when it finally rose to the surface, it shattered everything they constructed. The image they created for you didn't just collapse quietly. It collapsed loudly. Their narrative cracked in places they didn't even think people would look. The illusion dissolved right in front of the same audience they tried to manipulate. And the shock wasn't just in the fact that people no longer believed them. It was in how quickly others began to recognize the real you. The depth, the sincerity, the intelligence, the grace, the consistency. The goodness they tried so hard to bury ended up shining even brighter once the lies fell apart. This is their nightmare, not your success, but the truth about who you are becoming undeniable. People started connecting dots they previously ignored. They began reflecting on their own interactions with you versus the stories they were fed. They noticed your character never matched the narrative. They realized your actions never aligned with the rumors. And one by one, those quiet realizations turned into a collective shift in perception. Nothing drives a hater to madness faster than losing control of a lie they swore would define you. Now the spotlight is on your authenticity, not their accusations. The attention is on your purpose, not their projections. You didn't force this shift. Your character did. Your growth did. Your consistency did. The truth did exactly what truth does. It outlived every rumor. They're losing their sanity because people finally see the contrast. Your light exposed their shadows. Your honesty exposed their manipulation. Your rise exposed their insecurity. And now the world sees them for what they are, and you for who you've always been. Conclusion. When truths finally rise to the surface, they rise with force. And that's exactly what has happened in your story. Every hidden intention, every disguised agenda, every whisper that once surrounded your name has now been exposed by a much larger light. What began as quiet revelations has turned into a full unveiling. You were never who they said you were. You were never as small as they insisted. You were never as lost, confused, or powerless as they hoped you'd be. The truth that came out didn't simply correct a misunderstanding. It redefined the entire environment around you. Piece by piece, the real narrative revealed itself. You weren't weak. You were restrained. You weren't isolated. You were divinely backed. You didn't need closure. You already had clarity. You weren't the problem. You were the mirror that exposed theirs. You didn't lose value. Your absence proved your importance. You didn't fall behind. You outgrew the game they were playing. You didn't chase validation. People were quietly admiring you the entire time. And you didn't break from their attacks. Their credibility broke instead. What's happening now is not chaos. It's correction. It's the alignment of truth with perception. It's the moment where people finally recognize your authenticity, your integrity, your spiritual rank, and your inner strength. All the misunderstandings, all the misjudgments, all the false assumptions have burned away, leaving only the undeniable reality of who you truly are. That's why they're losing their sanity. The truth didn't just clear your name, it positioned you. It elevated you. It validated what you already knew about yourself long before anyone else did. You are stepping into a chapter where your name carries weight for the right reasons, where your presence is understood instead of misinterpreted, where your character speaks louder than their narratives. This is not just vindication, this is recognition, and it is only the beginning of what's unfolding for you. If this message resonated with you, if it spoke to your spirit, if it reminded you of your worth and your power, then make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs this clarity right now. Your support helps this message reach those who are walking the same path, and together we rise. God bless you.